This week's topic is the bony pelvis, along with how the fetus interacts with the pelvis in labor and birth. So you're welcome to watch this lecture before you start the readings, or if you've already done the readings, this is a nice way to know that you're pulling out the information that you ultimately need to retain for the week. So this isn't meant to be completely comprehensive, but is rather basically summarizing and hitting on the key points of what we're learning this week. So assuming you've already done the readings, I just want you to take a look at this pelvis and see what looks familiar and what pieces of this pelvis you understand. Can you find the sacrum? Do you see the coccyx? What parts comprise the pelvis itself? What three bones? Can you find them and label them? Along with that, what three areas have some flexibility during the birth? You know, that relaxin and progesterone can have a loosening effect on three areas here, and if women are able to be mobile in birth, she can get an extra up to 2 centimeters worth of diameter. So can we find where those places would be? Great. And what's our landmark for determining how far down the baby's head is when we're determining station? If we do a vaginal exam, what's our bony landmark there for measuring station? Do you see the pubic symphysis? That's our landmark for measuring fetal growth. So we'll start the measuring tape at the top of the pubic symphysis there. How about if you were going to measure the diagonal conjugate? Do you remember where your fingers would go to determine that? Can you see the ischial tuberosities? So just spend some time making sure that you're retaining that information, and you can always go back and watch the beginning of this after you've watched the full video and done your readings, if a lot of that felt unfamiliar. So to get started here, I just want us to go over different types of pelvises. So in the upper left there, we have our gynecoid pelvis, and that's basically what we're hoping to find if we're trying to figure out what type of pelvis a woman has. That's the most typical shape for women. It's nice and roomy for both the inlet and the outlet. So you can see our inlet here is this brim at the beginning, and then our outlet, and you can't really see from this picture, but that would be deeper in the ischial tuberosities to the sacrum there. Okay, so about 50% of women will have this gynecoid pelvis, and then this android pelvis. That's what most males have, and about 20% of females have an android pelvis as well. It can be a little trickier at birth, but nothing crazy. It's more likely to just be a little bit tighter all the way through. So not in any particular way, but just a little bit tighter all the way through. And babies are just a little bit more likely to be in an OP position when they're born, which basically means instead of coming out face down, they come out face up, which we'll go over in a little bit in this lecture. So then we'll move from there to this anthropoid pelvis. And you can see here with the anthropoid pelvis that the AP diameter at the inlet here is quite a bit wider, whereas this transverse diameter is a bit more narrow. So baby tends to settle in the AP diameter rather than in the transverse diameter like we would see with other babies. And that's about 25% of women's pelvises. So then the platyploid pelvis up in the upper right there, that's our trickiest one. So that's a little bit harder to engage since the AP diameter is narrow. But the bigger issue more so is at the outlet at the end. It can be pretty tight. And it looks like it would be pretty roomy, but it's that AP diameter that gets tight at the end there and can potentially cause some issues. So if you are doing pelvimetry during labor, you're thinking about all these bony landmarks as giving you a sense of how roomy a woman's pelvis is for that baby to settle through. Okay, so looking at pelvis types, here's just another way to look at it. So this first one here is our gynecoid pelvis, right? And we can basically just see that it's straight and roomy all the way through, so no issues there. And then this next one here is our anthropoid pelvis. That was in the bottom right of the last screen. And again, pretty decently roomy all the way through. just a little bit tighter, right? in the transverse diameter, but overall pretty roomy. And then here we've got our android pelvis. That's the one that most men have and 20% of women. So I think of this as, you know, like an oval in this direction, and this is looking kind of like an upright heart, and then this is being kind of oblong and oval in the other direction, and maybe kind of a squished heart. I don't know if that helps you, but that kind of helps me. So you can see here with an android pelvis, it's a little tighter throughout, but especially towards the end, it can get tight. And then the platyploid pelvis, again, it's tighter towards the beginning, so a little bit harder to really get engaged. And the end looks a little bit misleading, like it'd be really wide, but it's the AP diameter that can be a little bit tricky there. And it's not as narrow as it was at the inlet, but it's still pretty narrow. So mechanisms of labor, how does the baby move down through the pelvis? I've got a video I'm going to show you and talk while the video is playing so that you can see each of these stages. But basically, we know that baby's got to move down, so we settle in and we engage, and then the more baby flexes his or her head, the smaller diameter that the baby's head is going to be. So the descent and the flexion are kind of simultaneous throughout this whole process, but we'll start there. So we have descent and we have flexion, and then we have internal rotation. So we know that baby engages in the transverse diameter, and then when baby reaches the ischial spines, baby's going to rotate and have their head settle from the transverse diameter to the AP diameter. So that internal rotation is when we hit the ischial spines. And then we're staying flexed all the way down, but when the head finally emerges out, that's extension. So it's birth by extension is when the head comes out. And then since their head's been twisting, the rest of their body doesn't really line up with where their head is when the head emerges. So you see that the head, while it comes out, typically looking straight down, after the head comes out, then you see the baby's head turn from being straight up and down to the side, and that helps baby's head line up with the rest of their body. So we call that restitution, which we'll see here in a second as well. And then finally, expulsion is the rest of the baby coming out, which starts with the anterior shoulder, so the shoulder that's up by mom's pubic symphysis, and then the posterior shoulder. So if mom's lying on her back, you can think of it as the top shoulder and the bottom shoulder. But we're going to be catching babies in all positions, so it's good even now to start thinking about it as being the anterior shoulder and the posterior shoulder. Okay, so I'm just going to pull up the YouTube here. Oops, I'm going to scroll over. I'll just play this here. Okay, so we can see that we're settling in and baby's head is nice and flexed. And when we hit the ischial spines here, we're going to do that internal rotation. So there's baby doing the internal rotation, and we're still fairly flexed, but as the head comes out, we're born by extension. So you can see the head is tilting back. And then there's our external rotation for the head to line up better with the rest of the body. And there's our top shoulder and our bottom shoulder. So that's the expulsion there. We're just going to watch that one more time, and I think we're probably mostly watching this video, but now look up here at this video. You can see we're engaged at the transverse dimension there, right? And then we're going to reach our ischial spines here soon. These are our ischial spines, and to fit through that part, we have to do that internal rotation. Yep, so head's coming in a straight OA position, where the back of their head is right up against here, and then we have that external rotation. Top shoulder, or anterior shoulder, posterior shoulder clears the coccyx, and then we're out. So the anterior shoulder has to clear this pubic symphysis, and then our posterior shoulder has to clear the coccyx. And that link is here for you if you're wanting to watch it again on your own time. So we know that the degree of flexion that the baby's head has really impacts just how big of a diameter needs to emerge. So the diameter of the baby's head is all based on how flexed the baby's head is. So before we get into learning these terms, I think it's helpful for us to know what the regions are on a baby's head. So these are kind of big words and are a little bit confusing, but if you know what the regions are, then they all make perfect sense. So let's do this one first here at the bottom, because that one, well, we'll do regions, sorry. We're going to do regions first. So this is our occiput. You can think of the occipital bone, right? So that's why this one starts with occipital, and this one's going to start with suboccipital, so below the occiput. And then this region here is considered the vertex, so towards the back of baby's head, kind of right up top here. That's our vertex. And then bregma is refers to just straight on top of baby's head. So if you did buy a baby from the store, you're welcome to go ahead and label the baby's head, even right on your doll if that's helpful for your learning. And then we come over here, that's our frontal bone. So you can see that occipitofrontal would be straight from the back of the head to the frontal bone here. And then finally, mentum is referring to the chin, and then submento would be just below that. So let's look at each of these regions then. Ultimately, we want baby's head to be well flexed, right? So that's why this suboccipitobregmatic, so suboccipito, this region, to the bregma, that's our most ideal position, because that means that baby's head is really well flexed, and then this here is what you're seeing emerge. Okay, and that comes to about 9.5 centimeters. Now you'll notice that the submentobregmatic here is also 9.5 centimeters, and that would be a face presentation. So this is what you would see emerge. And that's also 9.5 centimeters. So the reason we're hoping for this rather than a face presentation is that there's so much blood rushing and squishing whatever's coming out first, that these babies can be born with lots of facial bruising, and potentially that could impact their airway too. So it can just, and it just looks really black and blue. So ideally we're not a face presentation, but in terms of difficulty of the baby getting out of the pelvis, no different. 9.5 centimeters, 9.5 centimeters. So just something to keep in mind if you're feeling that you're going to have a face presentation. All right, so then we've got the verticomental, which is the brow presentation. So this is when what you're feeling emerges right here, right? And that's 13.5 centimeters. So, so essentially baby's head is extended. So a face presentation is very extended, and then the brow presentation is an extension. And that's really hard to get out. We had a brow presentation at the birth center not that long ago, and mom pushed for a really long time, and we ended up having to transfer, and I don't remember offhand if that baby had a C-section or not, but they're really hard to get out, and I just remember seeing pictures of that poor baby the next day with just huge bruising, and so we really would like that baby's head to be nice and well flexed. So that's our brow presentation. And then lastly, our military presentation here would also be considered vertex, but not as ideal. Basically, this is when baby isn't flexed or extended. It's just coming straight out. And if it's coming straight out and not flexed, you can see, I've seen some textbooks say 12 centimeters, some say 11, but it's going to be bigger than if we can be nice and well flexed. All right. So to just kind of visualize that in a different way, this first one here is nice and well flexed. So that's our suboccipitobregmatic. And then here's our military position again when we're just going straight through. And so occipitofrontal. And then we've got our brow presentation here, and then our face presentation. So we go from nice and small to nice and small with extra wide in the middle. So we can actually feel baby's head to determine their position when moms are in labor. So if the cervix is open enough, then basically we're feeling baby's fontanelles and suture lines to determine what position the head is in. And I have a picture of fontanelles on the next page, but if you think of this as being our anterior fontanelle and this as being our posterior fontanelle, the more of the posterior fontanelle you're feeling, the more flexed baby's head is going to be. So if you're feeling a lot of the anterior fontanelle and can't hardly find the posterior fontanelle, that kind of gives you a sense of flexion, mildly speaking. So when we talk about fetal positions, there's 3 letters that you can see here. And the first letter refers to if baby is facing mom's left or mom's right. So the first letter is in relation to the mother. If babies are facing exactly face down or exactly face up, then you can just say straight OP or straight OA, and you don't need to have that first letter. So the second letter then refers to what part of the baby is presenting primarily. So if it's baby's occiput, or the back of their head, which is almost always what we have, then we use the letter O. So you can see in all of these pictures it's O. So when we talk about is the baby facing mom's left or mom's right, it's the back of baby's head, which is a little confusing. So you're not thinking about which way is baby facing. You're thinking of where is the back of baby's head in relation to mom's left side or mom's right side. So you see here, this is mom's left. So we have LO, because the back of baby's head is angled more towards mom's left. And even here, when baby's still rotated, the back of baby's head is still towards mom's left, so it's LO. If baby was presenting with their face, then you would use their chin. So you'd use the mentum. Oops, got a little typo there. Fix that right now. Okay, so you would use their mentum. So you'd think about which way is their chin facing. So if you find a face, then figure out where their chin is and think about is that closer to mom's left or mom's right. And then lastly, if baby was breech, then you'd be using their sacrum. So the first 2 are in reference to baby's backside. So sacrum, occiput, and it's just the mentum that would be in the front. And honestly, faces and breeches are rare enough that you can just process through it every time. Occiput will just be second nature, and then you can just slowly think through it if you get a mentum or sacrum. Finally, that last letter is in reference to mom's pelvis if it's more towards her anterior surface, which would be her pubic symphysis, versus posterior, which would be her sacrum. So again, we're thinking about the back of baby's head. So let's take this one for example. This is the most common position babies are in, LOA. So O is for the occiput, so back of baby's head. It's towards mom's left, that's why we're in L. And then it's more closer to mom's pubic symphysis than her sacrum. So the pubic symphysis would translate to being anterior. Whereas if this was rotated back closer to her sacrum, then we would say LOP, meaning it's posterior. So left occipito-posterior position. And if it's not really towards the back or the front, if you're feeling the suture line and it's just straight across here, straight across, then we would say LOT for transverse. And you'll get more of that when we get closer to delivering babies, but it's just nice to have a sense of understanding how the baby's navigating the pelvis, and that's what parts of the pelvis are important for us to understand at this point. Okay, so here we have our sagittal suture, so that's what we're feeling for running across here. And then basically you're putting your 2 fingers in, and you're going to see if you can find a fontanelle, and then you're thinking about which directions our suture lines are going. So if you're feeling an anterior fontanelle, it's like a diamond. Whereas if you find your posterior fontanelle, which hopefully you're feeling more of the posterior because that would mean the baby's well flexed, right? If it's a posterior fontanelle, the posterior fontanelle is actually more like a triangle. You see that occipital bone, but that's not a suture here. It's a triangle, so it goes like this. And I think of it kind of like an arrow. So it's going to point. It's pointing towards the anterior fontanelle. So you find your posterior fontanelle, and then you see which way it's pointing, and then you can feel the sagittal suture, and then you know you're angled towards the front of baby's head. So from there you can think about, okay, which way is the back of baby's head facing? And then that lets you know, are you LOA, ROT, etc. So I think this diagram on the right here is nice because you can see what position the baby's in, and then right under it you can see what you would be feeling. So that's how it would translate for what you're feeling. So that's your posterior fontanelle, that's your anterior fontanelle. So you can look through those, and you've got some good pictures in your readings this week of this stuff as well. And again, the more baby's head is flexed, I mean, obviously this is a breech, but just because we can see the whole head without the obstruction of the pelvis, that's our posterior fontanelle, that's our anterior fontanelle. If we're nice and well flexed, we'll find more posterior fontanelle. And as you're learning about this, I already alluded to this, but really try not to put yourself in a box in terms of thinking of mom as lying on her back and you checking her, because and therefore orienting yourself to, okay, that's because it's up and that's because it's down. Really try to think of it as anterior, posterior in relation to mom's pelvis, because you might be checking a mom while she's on her hands and knees, or she might be standing. So orienting your fingers to think about these letters in terms of her pubic symphysis and her sacrum is going to help you out in the long run. So hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to post them to the general forum, and then you guys can answer them for each other, and I can chime in too, and then that way if you're wondering about something, probably there's some others that are wondering it as well. All right, have a great week, everyone.